The hold smelled like 2 years. That was the only way Riven had ever been able to describe it to anyone who hadn't lived it. And even then the description was inadequate, because 2 years had a specific smell that changed depending on the hour and the temperature and how recently the recyclers had cycled. And right now, at 0340 ship time, with the recyclers running slow and the temperature set 3 degrees lower than regulation because Jax ran hot and had at some point in the last month simply broken the thermostat rather. Then continue arguing about it. The hold smelled like canvas and gun oil and the specific human musk of 412 people who had been told, for the first time in 24 months, that they did not have to be anywhere or do anything or kill anything for the next 18 days. The regiment was sleeping. Most of them, anyway. Riven sat with her back against the curved inner hull of the transport Calliope and watched the dark and listened to 400 people breathe and thought about nothing, which was something she had been trying to do since they crossed the departure line 3 days ago and had not yet managed. The thought she was trying not to think sat in the back of her skull like a stone. She had gotten good at not looking directly at it. She could go 4, sometimes 5 hours without looking directly at it. And when she did look, she made herself look sideways, the way you looked at dim stars, because the thing about dim stars was that if you looked straight at them, they disappeared, and Riven had found that her particular stone operated on a similar principle. If she looked at it sideways, it was just a shape, just a weight, something carried. She had been carrying it for 6 weeks. She would carry it the rest of her life. That was the agreement she had made with herself in the dark of the last firebase on Keln 4, kneeling in the mud with her hands not shaking, which had surprised her, the not shaking. She had expected her hands to shake. They had not. She had made the decision, carried it out, and her hands had been perfectly still throughout, and that stillness had frightened her more than anything the Veth had done to them in 2 years of grinding asymmetric warfare across 4 contested systems. And she had been thinking about those still hands every day since. She pressed her right palm flat against the hull. The Calliope hummed under her hand. Old ship, coalition surplus, civilian registry. One of the transport contracts the military used when it needed to move bodies from one place to another without advertising the movement. The hull was warm despite the recycled cold of the hold, the engine heat bleeding up through 3 inches of plating like something alive. Riven felt the specific vibration of the drives, a fractional wobble in the port secondary that the crew had been patching around for 6 months. The chief engineer had mentioned it in passing, and underneath that, steady as a pulse, the heartbeat of a ship that had been making this run for 11 years and would make it for 11 more if nothing went wrong. She thought, nothing will go wrong. She thought it without conviction, which was a problem she had developed somewhere in year 1 and never quite shed. Colt was awake. She could tell by the quality of his stillness. Colt, unconscious, looked like a man who had made peace with every bad decision in his life. Colt awake looked like a man thinking about which bad decision to make next. He was sitting 4 meters away with his back against a shipping container, his legs stretched out, his eyes on the middle distance, doing the thing he did with his right hand when he was thinking. 3 slow taps against his knee. Pause. 2 fast taps. Pause. Repeat. The same pattern he'd been doing since she met him 7 years ago and had never once commented on. She didn't comment on it now. After a while he said, quietly enough not to wake anyone, "You want the last one." He meant the last nutrition bar. He had 2. He always had 2. She had never once seen him eat both of them at the same time, and she had never quite been able to determine whether this was generosity or superstition or some third thing she didn't have a word for. "Go ahead," she said. "Sergeant Major." "Colt, you haven't eaten since 1800. I'm aware of when I last ate. The bar is synthetic protein and compressed glucose, and it tastes like a boot that someone washed once. You should eat it." "Then why are you offering it to me?" He considered this. "Professional respect," he said, and slid it across the deck toward her. She caught it without looking, peeled it open, ate it in 4 bites, and tasted nothing, which was accurate, and which was something she had noticed about herself in the last 6 weeks. The specific dimming of the physical world, sounds slightly muted, food slightly tasteless, the colors of things slightly less saturated than she remembered them being before. She had cataloged this without alarm. It was a known phenomenon. It would pass. Everything passed, eventually, into something else. Colt said, "What's the first thing you're going to eat? Actually eat. When we get back?" She thought about it. The thinking felt effortful in a way she didn't examine. I don't know. I'm going to eat a bowl of noodles, he said. Specifically, the kind with the broth that comes in a clay bowl, and they put a soft egg in it, and the egg is barely set, and when you break it, it runs into the broth, and it makes the broth. He stopped. Started again. My mother used to make it. Where does your mother live? A pause. Corinthia Station. That's 3 systems from the destination port. Yeah. Are you going to go? The 3 slow taps, 2 fast taps. The pause. Probably not this leave, he said. She didn't say anything. There was nothing to say that wasn't either a lie or a cruelty, and she preferred silence to either. She ate the last of the bar and folded the wrapper precisely in half, and then in half again, and put it in her left cargo pocket, because she had cleaned up after herself since she was 6 years old, and she wasn't going to stop now. In a hold on a transport ship somewhere between the Keln system and home, whatever home currently meant. What about you, he said. What about me, what? First real food. Back home. She thought about her apartment. She hadn't been there in 2 years. She had paid the maintenance fee by automatic transfer every month and otherwise not thought about it, and thinking about it now produced a feeling she couldn't name precisely. Not dread, not exactly. More like the feeling of trying to remember a word in a language she used to speak. There's a place near the port, she said. They do bread. Real bread, yeast bread, not the pressed stuff. It takes 3 days to make a loaf. 3 days. The fermentation. You've thought about this. I've thought about it, she said, which was not exactly true. She hadn't thought about it until 20 seconds ago, when the question made her reach for the nearest warm thing and find it there, a loaf of bread in a bakery near the port, the smell of it, the weight of it in her hands, the way the crust would sound when she broke it. The thought sat differently than the stone. The thought sat lightly. She noticed this. She filed it away. 40 meters forward in the hold, Jax was asleep on his back with his arms crossed over his chest like a statue of something, taking up the space of approximately 2 standard humans, his breathing so slow and regular it almost didn't seem like breathing at all. Jax had a method for sleeping. He had explained it once to Tara during the 2nd year, when Tara had come to him with the dark circles under her eyes and the admission that she hadn't slept more than 2 hours at a stretch in 3 weeks, and what he had told her was this. You pick a thing and you follow it. One thing, a sound or a feeling. You follow it down. And if it leads somewhere bad, you don't fight the bad thing. You just watch it, and you watch it from far enough away that it can't touch you, and then you follow it back up. Tara had looked at him for a long time and then said, that doesn't sound like sleeping. That sounds like being haunted on purpose. Jax had considered this and said, yeah. Tara was awake too. Riven could see the slight movement of her head against the container she was using as a pillow, the restless micro-adjustments of someone who had not yet learned to stop trying. She was 23. She had arrived at the regiment's replacement depot on Keln, for with her kit still creased and her boots still dark, and had in the subsequent 18 months done every single thing that was asked of her and a number of things that were not asked but needed doing, and she still tried too hard, and she would probably always try too hard, and this was not a flaw. Riven had been trying too hard since she was 19. She understood the architecture of it, the way the trying was actually a fear, a specific fear of the moment when you stopped trying and found out what was underneath. You kept trying so you never had to find out. She understood it. She also understood that Tara would find out eventually anyway. Everyone did. The hold breathed around her. For 100 bodies, most of them finally, genuinely still. Outside the hull, the dark between stars was absolute and indifferent and vast. She stopped. She didn't use that word, even in her own head. It was a habit she developed from Colt, who had once said, in the flat specific tone he used for things he actually believed, that language was the last thing you controlled when everything else was being taken, and you should choose yours like you chose your shots, with attention and purpose and the understanding that you wouldn't get many. Outside the hull, the dark between stars was deep and permanent and had no opinion about any of them. She pressed her palm against the warmth of the plating and listened to the Calliope breathe. The Calliope was 40 years old, which in the civilian transport registry made her middle-aged, and she wore her age the way people who have worked hard wear theirs. In the particular way she carried her weight, slightly forward, the bow assembly a fraction heavier than the drive specs technically allowed, because Captain Dre had added water tanks to the force section in year 12 and never removed them after the tank contract fell through. And in the sound of her corridors, which were never entirely quiet. There was always something working somewhere. A relay clicking, the environmental system cycling, the secondary heat exchangers doing the low rhythmic pulse they did when ambient temperature dropped below threshold, which given Jax's thermostat modification was continuous. The Calliope was never silent. She was a ship that talked to herself. Dre ran a tight ship in the ways that mattered and a loose one in the ways that didn't. He had 15 years on the civilian registry and had run everything from ore to livestock to, on 3 occasions, military personnel, and military personnel were by some margin the easiest cargo he'd ever moved. They required nothing. They occupied the hold like furniture. They took care of their own problems with a self-sufficiency that bordered on the eerie, and when they needed something from the crew they asked for it directly and without elaboration, and when the crew could not provide it they said understood and found another way. The only friction in the 3 days since departure had been the thermostat, and Jax had resolved the thermostat situation by breaking it, which Dre had initially objected to, and then accepted when Jax handed him 300 in hard currency and said for the inconvenience, which was a phrase Jax delivered with a directness that suggested he understood the word inconvenience to cover a range of situations up to and including property destruction. Dre had pocketed the money and not asked further questions. He was on the bridge now, at 0350, drinking coffee from a ceramic mug that his daughter had made him 11 years ago in a ceramics class, and the mug was slightly uneven and held roughly 40% less coffee than a standard mug, and he had never once used any other mug on this ship. He drank his undersized coffee and watched the scan readout and thought about port. The scan readout was clean. He watched it for a while. There was a debris field 8,000 kilometers off the port bow, remnants of something, industrial accident or old wreckage. Impossible to tell from this range, but the debris was distributed across a predictable arc and none of it was on an intersecting course. He logged it, tagged it for the registry, and moved on. He missed the 3 objects moving against the drift. Not because his equipment was bad. His equipment was adequate. He missed them because they were running the specific suppression profile that Shrev's crew had spent 4 years and a significant amount of borrowed money developing, which scattered mass readings into the surrounding debris return and made 3 ships, each 60 meters bow to stern, appear as diffuse metallic junk distributed across 40,000 cubic kilometers. Shrev had purchased the suppression profile from a Coalition signals engineer who had subsequently relocated to a world where the Coalition's jurisdiction was theoretical rather than operational. He used it on every job. In 43 boarding operations across 9 years, it had never failed him once. Shrev stood at the forward viewport of the Pale Talon and looked at the Calliope and felt the specific clean feeling of a job that was already half done. He had the manifest. He had gotten the manifest from the port registry at the last stopover. The Calliope was registered as running civilian mixed cargo, 60% hold space, listed crew of 9, departure from Kelm, for transit hub 3 days prior. He had cross-referenced the listing against the Kelm 4 orbital log and found the departure recorded at the registered time with the registered mass. The mass had come back 3% overlisted, which fell within normal variation for a cargo manifest filed ahead of loading completion. He had noted it. He had flagged it amber rather than red because 3% was within variation. He had moved on. 43 jobs. He had run 43 jobs, and the worst outcome had been a mercenary escort on a mining claim transfer 7 years ago. 2 fighters, poorly trained, easily managed. Before that, nothing. The scan spoke. He listened to the scan. The scan had never lied to him. He turned from the viewport and looked at Derek, his second, who was running the final approach calculations at the navigation console. Derek was meticulous in the way that anxious people were meticulous. He checked and rechecked not from confidence, but from fear of error, which meant his work was impeccable and his nerves were a constant low vibration that Shrev had learned to ignore the way you learn to ignore a sound your ship made that the engineers had checked 3 times and called normal. Mass confirmation, Shrev said. 3.2% overlisted. Within variation. Within variation, Derek confirmed. He hesitated. Say it, Shrev said. The overmass is consistent across all 3 scan passes. Usually variation drifts. This holds. Shrev looked at him. What you are describing is a scan that is returning consistent readings. Yes. A A consistent scan is a good scan. Yes, Derek said, with the tone of a man who had already lost the argument and knew it. Consistent is good. Consistent is good, Shrev agreed. He felt the clean feeling settle deeper. The Calliope was 900 meters ahead, her drives at cruise, her hull showing the standard running lights of a civilian transport that did not know it was being watched. He had taken bigger ships. He had taken ships running actual security, contracted gun platforms, 2 of them, a freight hauler 3 years back. The platforms had swept their lanes like professionals and missed the pale talon entirely because the suppression profile ate the return and spat out background. He had thanked the engineer in absentia and collected his fee. This was a transport. Listed crew of 9. 60% hold space. Easy credits. Bring us in, he said. The breach team was 17. They went in through the secondary cargo hatch, which was, as it almost always was on civilian transports, unlocked. Civilian cargo hatches were designed for repeated rapid access by dock workers and ran key codes rather than physical locks, and key codes, Shrev had discovered early in his career, were not designed to resist a device the size of his thumb and the price of a good meal. The hatch cycled. The team moved in. The corridor beyond was dark. Emergency lighting only, amber-red strips along the floor edge that turned everything the color of old blood. The corridor ran 40 meters and turned left toward the main hold. The team moved quietly. Boots on metal. They were professionals. They had done this before. The sound of them moving was a series of deliberate compressions. Weight shifted forward, heel to toe, the specific discipline of people who understood the value of not announcing themselves. Var was on point. She was small and very fast, and had an instinct for geometry that Shrev had come to rely on in the same way he relied on his suppression profile. Not because it was flawless, but because in 7 years it had never seriously failed him. She moved down the corridor with her scan device sweeping the space ahead, reading ambient temperature, sound pressure, movement. She turned the corner toward the hold. She stopped. She held up her fist. The team stopped behind her. The sound was wrong. Not an alarm. Not movement. Something else. She took 3 seconds to process it, and in those 3 seconds she identified it. Breathing. Regular, deep, the breathing of sleep, the specific audio signature of multiple people, and the sound was coming from the hold ahead, and it was not the sound of 9 people asleep. She looked at her scan device. The ambient return was high, which meant bodies, which meant heat, which meant. She turned to pass the reading back to the second in line, and in the amber light of the corridor, she looked at the number the scanner had resolved to, and she stood very still for 1 second that felt longer. The number was not 9. She turned back toward the hold. The hold door was not fully sealed. It was the kind of civilian transport hold door that latched rather than sealed because the dock workers needed rapid access and full seal slowed turnaround. And through the gap at the bottom of the door, the 2 centimeters of space between the door's lower edge and the deck plate, there was a line of different light. Not the amber emergency red of the corridor. Something slightly cooler. The running lights of the hold interior. And in that gap of light, at the level of the floor, she could see the edge of something. A boot. 1 boot, regulation cut. The specific flat-soled profile she had a professional reason to recognize because she had spent 4 years carrying a firearm in proximity to people who wore that exact boot. Military issue. She turned back. The second in line read her face. He read it correctly. He began to turn to pass the message back, and as he turned, the hold door opened from the inside, and the light from the hold fell across all 17 of them at once, and standing in the doorway, barefoot, in a regulation undershirt with her arms loose at her sides, and her eyes carrying an expression that had no alarm in it whatsoever, no surprise, nothing that resembled the reaction of someone who had not been expecting company, was Sergeant Major Riven of the 14th Coalition Marine Regiment, who had heard the hatch cycle 4 minutes ago and had been waiting since then for exactly this. She looked at them. They looked at her. Behind her, in the hold, the sound of 400 people waking up spread like a tide. She said nothing. She just stepped to the side. And they saw. Here is part 2. The hold of the Calliope was 40 meters wide and 60 meters deep, and it contained, in addition to 308 tons of mixed cargo in sealed containers, 412 members of the 14th Coalition Marine Regiment. And in the 7 seconds between the door opening and the first member of Shrev's breach team taking a step backward, Approximately 300 of those 412 had come fully awake. Marines did not wake the way civilians woke. There was no gradual surfacing, no blinking confusion, no reaching for context. They went from asleep to present in the space of a single breath, and the transition was not gentle. It was the kind of waking that 2 years of contested deployment installed in a person the way a surgeon installed a plate. Not natural, not comfortable, but permanent, load-bearing, and extraordinarily difficult to remove. They woke and they read the room, and they were already moving before the read was complete, which meant that in those 7 seconds the hold went from the specific stillness of mass sleep to a controlled and utterly silent reorganization that positioned 400 bodies between the breach team and every exit. No one shouted. That was the thing Var would remember later. In the medical bay, while the bone knit compound did its work and a coalition search and rescue medic asked her gentle questions she declined to answer. No one shouted. There were no battle cries. There was no dramatic announcement. 400 soldiers in various states of undress simply arranged themselves with the calm efficiency of people who did not need to be told what a threat was or what to do about it. And the silence of the arrangement was the most frightening thing she had ever experienced in a career that had included a number of frightening things. Riven stood in the doorway and said, "Put them down." She was not talking to her people. Var looked at the scanner in her hand. She looked at the door. She set the scanner on the deck. The second in line set his weapon on the deck. Behind them, working backward through the breach team, the sound of equipment being placed on metal moved down the corridor like a slow wave. Riven watched it happen. She said nothing. When the last sound had finished, she looked at Var for a long moment, and Var looked back, and neither of them said anything for 3 seconds. And then Riven said, "How many more on your ships?" Var said nothing. "I'm going to assume 30, Riven said, because that's the standard crew load for a 3-ship independent operation with your suppression profile. And I'm going to contact your ships in." She looked at something behind the door, presumably a watch, for minutes, "and I'm going to tell them that their captain has decided to stand down, and they're going to believe me, because your captain is going to tell them the same thing at the same time. And then we're all going to sit in this hold for the next 15 days until this ship reaches port and everyone goes home." She paused. "That's one way this goes." Var said, "What's the other way?" Riven looked at her. "You've already seen the other way," she said. "You're standing in it." Shrev received the call 11 minutes after the breach team went dark. He had given them 8 minutes before he started worrying, which was generous. A clean board and extract on a civilian transport ran 6 minutes on average. Var's team had been slower. He had chalked the extra 2 minutes to the larger-than-expected hold space. At 9 minutes, he told himself the comms were cycling. At 10 minutes, he told Derek to run a diagnostic. At 11 minutes, the comms opened from the Calliope's bridge channel, and a voice he did not recognize said, "This is Sergeant Major Riven, 14th Coalition Marines. Your crew is alive and unhurt. Your breach team is secured. You're going to stand your ships down and match our vector, or I'm going to give my regiment something to do for the first time in 3 days. Your choice. You have 90 seconds. Shrev stood at his console. He looked at Derek. Derek looked back at him with an expression that said, "I told you the reading was consistent." He had not told him that. He had implied it. Shrev was not in a position to make the distinction. He thought, with the specific precision of a mind that had stayed alive for 43 operations by being honest with itself at critical moments, about the phrase "something to do" for the first time in 3 days. He parsed it. He considered the implications of a regiment of soldiers, fresh off a 2-year combat deployment, who had been contained in a hold for 72 hours with nothing to engage their very specific skill set. He considered what that meant in terms of accumulated energy. He considered what a pressure vessel did when the relief valve had been closed too long. He opened the channel. "Standing down," he said. They put the breach team in the fore-cargo section, which was smaller than the main hold and separated by 2 bulkheads, and they left them their kit minus the weapons and gave them water and rations and 3 portable lights. Riven set a 4-person watch rotation and briefed it in 90 seconds and did not ask if there were questions because the rotation was straightforward and her people did not ask questions about straightforward things. Then she went back to her spot against the hull. Colt was already there, eating the second nutrition bar, which he had apparently retrieved from somewhere. He looked at her. She sat down. "So," he said. "So, pirates. Apparently." He chewed. Swallowed. You know what I keep thinking about, he said. Tell me. I keep thinking about how I was asleep. I was actually asleep. I was having a dream about, he stopped. Never mind what I was having a dream about. The point is I was asleep. Actually asleep, not the watching from far away thing, actually under. And I woke up and the first thing I thought was not oh no, pirates. The first thing I thought was, oh good, something to do. Riven said nothing. That's not a healthy response, Colt said. No. A healthy response would be, oh no, pirates. Probably. He was quiet for a moment. What does it mean that I was relieved? She thought about how to answer this and decided on honesty, which was what she usually decided on when the question deserved it and the asker was capable of handling it. It means you've been running at a particular speed for 2 years, and the speed doesn't just stop because the mission does. When does it stop? I don't know. Has it stopped for you? Ever? She looked at the middle distance, at the hold full of her people, most of whom were settling back into the shapes they'd occupied before the interruption, some of them already asleep again, which said something about them that she respected deeply. Not yet, she said. He nodded. 3 slow taps. Too fast. The noodles, he said, after a while. What about them? In the dream. It was the noodles. The clay bowl. My mother was. He stopped again. She noticed he kept stopping at his mother. She did not push. She was putting the egg in, he said. That was the moment. Just that. The egg going in. That's a good dream, Riven said. Yeah. She looked at her hands. There's a bakery, she said, which surprised her. She hadn't intended to say it out loud. Near my port. I used to go on Sunday mornings. Early, before it was busy. They'd be pulling the loaves out when I got there, and the whole street smelled like it. She paused. I haven't been there in 3 years. I moved to the sector posting, and then, she stopped. I don't know if it's still there. It's probably still there, Colt said. Place is close. Bakeries that make 3-day bread don't close, he said, with the specific conviction of someone making an argument they needed to be true. That's a place that's been there 60 years. That's a place that'll be there when we're not. She looked at him. When we're retired, he clarified. I meant retired. I know what you meant, she said. They sat with that for a while, the hold breathing around them, the calliope humming through the plating, and Riven thought about the bakery, and whether it was still there, and whether she would walk through the door on a Sunday morning, and whether the smell would still be the same, and she noticed the thinking felt like stretching a muscle that had been clenched for a long time, the specific ache of something beginning to unknot. She noticed it. She held it carefully. She didn't trust it yet, but she noticed it. Mace had the instrument out. No one had asked him to get it out. It wasn't that kind of moment. There was no occasion, no shared permission, no one had decided this was the time. He had simply retrieved it from his kit because it was 0520, and he couldn't sleep and his hands needed something to do. And the instrument was a 12-string resonance box about the size of a hardback book that he had carried through 2 deployments in a padded case strapped to the inside of his main kit bag, and it had taken 1 piece of shrapnel and been repaired with a piece of comm wire and 2 squares of adhesive seal tape, and it still played. He sat cross-legged in the middle of the hold with the instrument in his lap and played. He didn't play anything specific. He didn't play anything he could have named. He played the way people played when they were playing for themselves, moving through shapes and sounds with the loose attention of someone following a feeling rather than a structure, and the sound that came out was low and resonant and spread through the hold the way warmth spread through cold space, which was slowly, and from the center outward, and without asking anyone's permission. One by one, the people who were awake stopped what they were doing. Tara was sitting against the port hull with her knees up and her arms around her knees, and she had been doing the thing she did when she couldn't sleep, which was run through procedures in her head: field tree-off, extraction protocols, breach team response matrices. Not because she needed to, but because the motion of the procedures kept the other thoughts from settling. When the sound started, she stopped running the procedures. She listened. She didn't close her eyes. She just stopped moving and listened with her whole body, the way she had listened to her grandmother's voice when she was very small, and the listening was so complete that it became a kind of shelter. Brone was awake and had been quietly reorganizing his kit for the 3rd time since they'd boarded, which was what he did when he was restless, and he stopped reorganizing and sat with his back against his kit bag and looked at the ceiling, and the sound got into him somewhere between his ribs and his sternum, and he felt it there in the specific place he usually kept a joke. He thought about the joke. He didn't make it. He let the sound sit in the joke place and was surprised to find it fit. Jax opened his eyes, looked at Mace, and closed his eyes again, which for Jax was an expression of contentment so complete it was almost visible. 20 people awake in the hold, and not one of them spoke. The calliope hummed underneath the music, and the music was inside the humming, and for 11 minutes. While Mace played, and the hold held them. They were not a regiment, and not a weapon, and not the specific accumulation of everything the last 2 years had made them. They were just people in a room with music, which was one of the oldest things human beings had ever been, and the oldness of it was in the sound, and everyone in the hold who was awake felt it, and no one said anything about it, then or afterward, because it was the kind of thing that stopped being itself the moment it was described. Mace played for 11 minutes. Then he put the instrument back in its padded case and lay down and went to sleep, and the hold was quiet again, and the quiet was different from the quiet before. In the forecargo section, Var sat against the bulkhead with her arms around her knees and listened to the faint sound coming through the wall and didn't know what it was, but felt it anyway, which she also would not talk about later, though for different reasons. Brone made the first joke at 0630 during the watch rotation, when Sergeant Storm was doing the head count and miscounted because someone had shifted position in the night and came up one short and did the count twice more before looking at Brone with an expression of controlled alarm, at which point Brone said, completely deadpan, "One of ours is in with the pirates." Storm stared at him. Or, Brone said, "One of the pirates is in with us." Hard to say. Could be either. Storm counted a fourth time. Found the full number. Turned to Brone. "You're doing extra watch tonight." "Worth it," Brone said. Riven, who had heard this from 4 meters away, did not visibly react, which meant she was working hard not to, which Cold observed and filed under evidence that she was still in there somewhere, still reachable, still the person who had once, on Kelm 3, laughed so hard at one of Brone's funeral wrong jokes that she'd had to sit down with her hands on her knees, which had been 2 years ago now, before the stone, and which Colt thought about sometimes as a kind of proof. The day passed. That was the only way to describe it. The regiment occupied itself with the specific low-level industry of people who knew how to fill time in confined spaces, maintenance, equipment checks, the endless small tasks of kit that military people generated the way civilian people generated laundry. Tara spent 4 hours working through hand-to-hand drills with Sora, slowly, methodically, not for fitness, but for the meditative quality of forms repeated until they stopped requiring thought. Jack slept for 6 more hours. Brone told 3 more jokes, each worse than the last, each received with the specific laughing silence of people who recognized their own darkness and chose to call it humor. Captain Dre brought the watch rotation food from the galley, real food, heated, in containers, without being asked. He did this twice. On the second visit, he didn't say anything, just set the containers down and went back to the bridge, and Riven looked at the containers and thought about the 300 credits Jax had given him for the thermostat, and thought that was a man who understood what was in his hold and had decided to be something other than frightened by it. She respected that. She filed it under the small category of things she was trying to build a list of. In the forecargo section, she checked on the breach team twice. They were subdued. They were not mistreated. They had their lights and their water and their rations, and the 4-person watch was professional and courteous in the way that military people are courteous to prisoners. Correct, impersonal, the courtesy of a category rather than a choice. Var had stopped speaking entirely, which Riven read not as hostility, but as the particular silence of someone processing something they didn't have a framework for yet. She understood the feeling. The watch changed. The lights cycled. The calliope moved through the dark at cruise speed, and the debris field fell behind them, and the next waypoint was 9 days out. On the pale talon, Shrev sat in the captain's chair and did the thing he had been doing since he stood down, which was running the approach data through the calculation software for the 4th time. The software was good software. He trusted it. He had purchased it from the same engineer who had sold him the suppression profile, and it had given him accurate readings on 43 operations without a significant error. He ran the final approach data. The software returned the same result it had returned the previous 3 times. The calliope at final approach had registered a mass of 3% over listed manifest, within standard variation. The suppression profile had shown 9 life signs, consistent with listed crew, the additional mass attributed to cargo variation. There was no reading in the database for what the actual configuration had been. The software had not failed. The software had done exactly what it was designed to do. The problem was not the software. He sat with that. He thought about the word regiment. He was familiar with the word in the abstract. In the way that a craftsman was familiar with the properties of a material he had never worked with. He knew the definition. He knew the numerical composition in theory. He had not, before today, been in proximity to one. He thought about the 7 seconds between the door opening and the last member of his breach team setting their equipment on the deck. 7 seconds. No one had fired. No one had threatened. No one had done anything except arrange themselves and wait. And the waiting had been. He searched for the word in his language and did not quite find it. The waiting had carried a quality he had no precise term for. Something between patience and absolute certainty. The certainty of something that did not need to prove itself. He thought about Var's face when she had turned from the scanner. He pulled up the scan data again. He looked at the overmass figure. 3.2%. He ran the conversion. He looked at the number in raw mass terms. He sat back. 3.2% over listed manifest on a Calliope-class transport, at standard cargo density, represented. He checked the conversion, between 300 and 450 additional kilograms, which at average human body weight, he checked, represented between 4 and 6 people. The software had calculated cargo variation. The software was wrong. Not wrong in the way software was wrong when it had a flaw. Wrong in the way a map was wrong when it was drawn before the territory changed. The suppression profile suppressed mass returns to listed baseline by distributing overage across the debris field return, and the distribution was designed to simulate the irregular mass signature of inert cargo variation. And it was very good at this, and what it was not designed for, what no one had ever thought to design for, because no one had ever conceived of this specific situation as a situation that could occur, was a transport carrying 412 human beings running hot, alive, metabolically active, 412 bodies generating heat signatures that the suppression profile had read as debris thermal variation and discarded. The software had seen exactly what it was told to see. He looked at the scan display for a long time. Then he opened the channel to the Calliope. "Sergeant Major," he said. A pause. Her voice, same as before, unhurried. No particular register of victory or contempt, just a voice delivering information. "Captain, I want to understand," he said, "how the scan read 9. Another pause. Slightly longer. He thought she might not answer, and then she said, "Your suppression system converts excess mass to debris variation. Humans run hot. You were reading 400 people as thermal noise." He absorbed this. "You knew about the suppression profile." "I recognized the approach signature," she said. "We've seen variations of it." "And you waited." "We waited," she confirmed. He thought about 43 operations. He thought about the clean feeling he'd had at the viewport, looking at the Calliope with her running lights on, 900 meters ahead in the dark, easy credits, a known task executed by a craftsman who knew his craft. He thought about how the clean feeling had been built on a foundation that had never been tested in this specific way, because this specific way had not been a thing that existed until it was. He said, "What would you have done if we had not stood down?" The pause this time was different. He couldn't read it. "We would have had something to do," she said. He closed the channel. He sat in the captain's chair for a long time. Outside the viewport, the Calliope moved through the dark at cruise, and in her hold 400 Marines were doing the things Marines did in transit, and whatever those things were, he did not know, and he found that the not knowing was a new and specific kind of discomfort, different from the operational concern of an adversary's unknown capability. It was more personal than that. It was the feeling of realizing that you had built your understanding of something on a set of assumptions that were technically accurate and fundamentally insufficient. He had looked at the numbers. He had done the math. He had seen civilian transport, 9 crew, 3% over, within variation. He had not seen 2 years. The second joke happened at 1400. Brown was on watch rotation outside the 4 cargo section when one of the breach team, through the door, asked if they were going to be transferred to a detention facility at port. Brown considered the question with great seriousness. "Depends," he said. "On what?" "On whether the sergeant major decides to fill out the paperwork," Brown said. "She's real busy. Got a lot on. Might not get to it." A pause from the other side of the door. If she doesn't fill out the paperwork, Brone continued, technically you don't exist. Administratively speaking. Which means when we get to port, he made a sound like something dissolving. You know how bureaucracy works. From the other side of the door, silence. Then, quietly, one of the breach teams said, is he serious? From further down the corridor, Colt's voice. Never ask that. It doesn't help. Riven, for bulkheads away on the bridge confirming approach vectors with Dre, heard the laughter through the ship's open internal channel and did not react visibly. And Dre, who was watching her profile out of the corner of his eye, because he had been watching her profile off and on for 3 days trying to understand what he was looking at, saw something shift very slightly in the line of her jaw. The specific micro-relaxation of a muscle that had been held tense for a long time, lasting perhaps 2 seconds before it reset. He decided not to mention it. On the 7th day, the Calliope passed through the Morel waypoint, and the drive cycled to the long burn configuration that would carry them to port in 9 days, and Riven stood at the 4 observation port, a small viewport barely wide enough to frame a face, the only external viewport in the hold section, and looked at the dark. She had been avoiding this. Not the dark specifically. She had lived in and around space for 18 years, and she had never been afraid of the dark. She had been avoiding the specific combination of the dark and the stillness, and the time to look at things she had been not looking at for 6 weeks. The hold and the regiment, and then the pirates and the management of the pirates had given her structure, and structure was the thing she used the way some people use sleep, to fill the space where the things she didn't want to think about would otherwise expand. She looked at the dark. The dark looked back. She thought about Kelm 4. She thought about the firebase and the mud and the specific smell of that world, which was iron-rich soil and something like ammonia that came from the local vegetation and which she would smell in certain kinds of rain for the rest of her life and would never fully be able to explain to anyone who hadn't been there. She thought about the last day. She thought about the decision. She looked at it sideways, the way she had learned to do, and it held its shape and did not expand and did not dissolve. A man named Torval had been in the firebase when it should not have been possible for anyone to be in the firebase. He had come through the east perimeter in the dark, alone, and he had been, she thought the right word, made herself use it, surrendering. He had been trying to surrender, and he had moved wrong in the dark, and her hand had been steady. She had looked it up, afterward. His name, his rank, his unit. She had found his record in the Coalition Intelligence Database. He had been 26 years old. He had a family designation on file that translated, in the loose way that alien family structures translated, to something like wife and something like children. She had been carrying this for 6 weeks. She looked at it now, in the dark of the viewport, and she did not look away. She let it be the weight it was. She did not try to make it lighter, and she did not try to make it heavier, and she did not try to name what she had done as the right thing or the wrong thing, because she understood now, after 2 years, that the right thing wrong thing map did not apply to the dark outside of Firebase in the mud at 0300. And the people who had never been in the dark outside of Firebase applied that map from a very great distance and called the application justice, and she did not hate them for it. She held the weight. She breathed. She did not look away. After a while, the weight was still there, but it was no longer in her skull. It was in her chest, which was where things went when you stopped running from them and decided to carry them instead. Her hands were at her sides. They were not shaking. She stood at the viewport for 20 minutes. Then she went back to the hold. The third joke happened at 2200 on day 9. It happened because of Tara. Tara had been on watch outside the 4 cargo section and had been doing a head count through the viewport glass, which was standard, and had miscounted and been recounting when one of the breach team, the small fast one, Var, had looked up from where she was sitting and said, through the glass, with a kind of resigned professionalism, 17. There are 17 of us. Tara had written it down. Then she had looked up and said, thank you. Var had looked at her for a moment. Then she said, how many of you are there? Total. Tara told her. Var was quiet for a moment. Then she said, in a tone that was not quite anything Tara had a name for, the scans said 9. We know, Tara said. The suppression profile reads metabolic heat as thermal noise. Var stared at her. You know about the... We've seen variations, Tara said, which was what Riven had told her to say if anyone asked. Var stared at her for another moment. Then she said, 412. Yes. A very long pause. On shore leave, Var said. Yes. The sound that came from the fore-cargo section after that was not quite laughter. It was the sound of 17 people confronting an absurdity so complete that the only available response was something that functioned like laughter, because the alternative was something that functioned like despair. It came through the viewport glass in waves, each wave slightly different from the last, and Tara stood outside the door and listened to it, and after a moment, uncertain, looked down the corridor toward the main hold. Brone had come around the corner. He was looking at her. She looked back. "What's funny?" he said. "I think," she started. "I think they just did the math." Brone listened to the sound coming through the door. He tilted his head. Then he started laughing too, in the way he laughed when something was genuinely terrible, which was the best way he laughed, the way that lived closest to the truth of things, and the sound of it mixed with the sound through the door, and for a moment both sides of the bulkhead were in the same darkness together, which was not forgiveness and not understanding, but was something that had no name that was nevertheless real. On the 11th day, Shrev sent the distress signal. He sent it because Derek had raised the question 3 days earlier, and Shrev had deflected it. And Derek had raised it again the following day, and Shrev had deflected again. And on the 11th day, Derek came to him in the captain's quarters and stood in the door and said, quietly, "We have to file a report eventually." Shrev looked at him. "We are already in violation of 7 separate regulations." 8, Derek said. I counted again. "The signal will confirm our position and circumstances to coalition authorities." "Yes." "We will be taken into custody at port." "Yes." Shrev was quiet for a moment. "Is that what you want?" Derek thought about this with the seriousness he brought to all things. "I want to not be on these ships for the next 8 days in a state of ambiguity," he said. He stopped. "I want to know what happens next. The not knowing is worse than the knowing." Shrev looked at the viewport. The Calliope was visible off the bow, 100 meters ahead, her running lights steady, moving through the dark at cruise. He thought about the 7 seconds. He thought about 400 people waking up in one breath. He thought about the readout that had said 9 and the world that had contained 412 and the distance between those two numbers, which was not actually a numerical distance, but a distance of a different kind, a distance between what could be calculated and what actually was. He opened the emergency channel. He said, in the flat, declarative tone of a distress signal, "This is the independent vessel Pale Talon. Position follows, declaring emergency, awaiting assistance, all crew present." He read the coordinates. He closed the channel. Then he sat in the dark of his quarters and listened to Calliope's drives, faint through the hull, and thought about a map that had been drawn before the territory changed, and did not sleep. The search and rescue vessel Ardent reached the coordinates 16 hours after the signal, which was fast for that sector. Fast enough that the duty officer who had logged the distress call had flagged it for priority response based on the originating vessel's last known registry, which had come back with 3 outstanding warrants across 2 jurisdictions, and the specific notation that independent vessels operating under this registration had a documented history of contact with civilian transports. The duty officer had sent the Ardent with a full security complement and a medical team and a set of standing orders that anticipated, based on prior contact with vessels of this registry, a situation involving subdued civilians, potential casualties, and the need for immediate extraction. The Ardent came out of transit burn at 600 kilometers and ran its scan. The scan returned 3 ships matching the distress signals registry, holding position in loose formation. All 3 ships showed full power. No debris field. No evidence of drive failure or hull compromise. The Calliope was 100 meters ahead of the formation, also full power, also holding, her running lights steady and her drive at cruise idle, as if she were waiting for something. Lieutenant Sorvin, commanding the Ardent, looked at the scan return and said nothing for a moment. "All ships intact," said his scan officer. "I see that. No distress indicators beyond the signal itself." "I see that too." He opened the hailing channel. "Calliope, this is the rescue vessel Ardent. Please confirm status." The channel opened immediately, which meant someone had been waiting at the console, and the voice that came through was unhurried and precise, and carried the specific register that Sorvin, who had done 3 years in fleet security before his rescue commission, recognized as the voice of someone in the military talking to someone not in the military. Correct, informative, not quite deferential. "Ardent, This is Sergeant Major Riven, 14th Marine Regiment, aboard the Calliope. We have 17 guests in the forecargo section. Non-hostile, secured, require medical evaluation and transfer to coalition custody. The Calliope is undamaged. My regiment is present and accounted for. We are ready to receive you. Sorvin absorbed this. He looked at his scan officer, who looked back at him with an expression of careful neutrality. 17 guests, Sorvin repeated, into the open channel. Correct, Riven said. From 3 ships. Correct. He looked at the scan return again. The 3 independent vessels, full power, holding position, like dogs that had been told to sit, and were sitting. What is the condition of the guests, he said. A brief pause. Medically stable. Some contusions. No serious injuries. How did they sustain the contusions? The pause this time was slightly longer. They were in a confined space for 11 days, Riven said. Confined spaces create risk of incidental contact with surfaces. Sorvin looked at his scan officer again. The scan officer was looking at the far bulkhead and doing the specific thing people did when they were trying not to have a reaction. Understood, Sorvin said. We're coming alongside. He closed the channel. He sat for a moment. Then he said to his security lead, who was standing at the back of the bridge with his arms folded, full complement. Medical team first. Expecting resistance. No, Sorvin said. He thought about how to say the next part. I'm expecting, context, that I want the medical team to provide before I talk to anyone. The Ardent's medical team boarded through the main hatch and were met by a corporal named Colt, who was leaning against the corridor wall with his arms folded and his expression perfectly neutral. He looked at the medical team. He looked at the security complement behind them. He looked at Sorvin. Sergeant Major's in the hold, he said. The guests are through there. He pointed. 17 of them. Physically intact, a few bruises, one possible hairline fracture in the wrist of the one called Var. She caught a bulkhead in the dark on day 3. He paused. She didn't mention it. We noticed her favoring it, and she declined treatment. Your people should check it. He said this last part without any particular effect, which was the most interesting thing about it. The security lead said, We'll need a full incident report. The sergeant major will provide one, Colt said. He pushed off the wall. Come on. Sorvin walked the length of the Calliope's main corridor and through the hold door, and what he saw when he walked through the door was this. For 100 soldiers in various states of organized rest, kits squared and stowed, the hold clean, the lighting steady, and an order and density of occupation that should not have been possible in a civilian transport hold, but had been made to work by the specific ingenuity of people who had been making things work in worse conditions for 2 years. They looked at him when he entered, not with hostility, not with wariness, just with the brief calibrating attention of people registering a new element in their environment and categorizing it as non-threatening and returning to what they were doing. He felt the attention pass over him like a wave. He had been in fleet security for 3 years. He had walked into rooms where things had gone wrong. He had developed, over those 3 years, a specific sensitivity for the atmosphere of aftermath, the specific quality of air in a space where something had happened. He felt it now. Not fear, not the residue of violence exactly, something older than both. The atmosphere of a space that had been held by people who were very good at holding spaces, and who had done so without particular drama. Riven was standing near the fore bulkhead. She was in duty fatigues with her sleeves rolled, and she looked like someone who had been awake for most of 11 days and had declined to let that affect her posture. She looked at him when he approached. He was 6 feet tall. She met his eyes at exactly his height. He said, Sergeant Major. She said, Lieutenant. Do you want to tell me what happened? She told him. She told him in the flat, sequential way that military people delivered incident reports, chronological, precise, no editorializing. She told him about the approach signature, the breach team, the stand down, the 11 days. She told him about the distress signal that Shrev had sent, which she said she had been expecting since day 7, and which she had not interfered with because it was his right to send, and because the outcome would be the same either way. She told him all of this in approximately 4 minutes. When she finished, Sorvin stood with his datapad in one hand and his stylus in the other, and said, You had 400 Marines. 412, she said, against 47 pirates. 17 aboard. 30 on the ships. Who stood down immediately. Correct. He made a note. He looked at his notes. He said, carefully. Were the guests at any point in danger? Riven looked at him with an expression that was not quite anything he had a name for. No, she said. The contusions. Incidental contact with surfaces, she said. Confined spaces. Day 3. He wrote it down. He was aware that he was writing down a description of events that was technically accurate, and that the technical accuracy was doing a significant amount of work. He was also aware that the 4 cargo section contained 17 individuals who had boarded a military transport armed and with intent, and who were currently physically intact and medically stable, and that this outcome was not the obvious one, and that the space between the obvious outcome and the actual outcome was a space shaped like a choice. And the choice had been made by someone standing in front of him with her sleeves rolled and her eyes level, and he found he did not have a regulation that covered this specific shape. He wrote down incidental contact with surfaces. He said, "We'll need to transport the guests to the detention facility at Morel Station." "Understood," she said. "Colt will coordinate the transfer." He nodded. He started to turn, and then stopped, and turned back, and said, because he needed to understand something. "Why didn't you?" When they first came through the door. "Why didn't you?" He stopped, because he wasn't sure how to finish the question in a way that was professional. She looked at him for a moment. "Because they put their weapons down," she said. He thought about that on the walk back to the Ardent. The transfer took 4 hours. Sorvin's security complement moved the breach team from the 4 cargo section to the Ardent's detention bay, and each of them walked the corridor between the sections with the specific quality of motion that people had when they were trying to take up as little space as possible. They were not mistreated. They were processed with correctness. They did not speak. Var was last. She walked the corridor with Colt 2 steps behind her and Tara 2 steps ahead, and when she reached the hatch she stopped and looked back. Once, and the look was not at the corridor and not at the ship. It was at Tara. Tara looked back. Var said, in the flat declarative tone of someone stating a fact they had recently arrived at, "You were on shore leave." "Yes," Tara said. Var looked at her for a moment longer. Then she went through the hatch. Tara stood in the corridor for a few seconds after the hatch sealed. Then she went back to the hold. Shrev was the last to transfer from the Pale Talon. He came aboard the Ardent under escort. 2 of Sorvin's security complement, large, professional, courteous in the way Riven's people had been courteous, which he noted, and was processed into the detention bay and given water and a meal pack and a cot, and the door was sealed, and he was alone for the first time in 11 days. He sat on the cot. The Ardent's medical officer came through the door after an hour and checked him for injuries, which there were none of, and asked him standard intake questions, which he answered, and then asked if he needed anything else, which he did not, and left. He sat alone. He thought about the scan. He had been thinking about the scan, off and on, for 11 days, but now he was thinking about it differently. Not with the analytical precision he had brought to it before. The software, the suppression profile, the thermal noise, the distance between the listed mass and the actual mass. He was thinking about it from the other direction, from the inside of the number. 412. He thought about what 412 people looked like when they woke up. He had seen it. 7 seconds. No sound above a certain level, no alarm, no theatrics. Just the specific and total reorganization of a space by people who had been doing this specific kind of reorganization for 2 years and for whom it had become as automatic as breathing, as unremarkable as standing up. He thought about the door opening and Riven in the doorway, barefoot, in an undershirt, arms loose, and the expression on her face which had contained no surprise and no triumph and nothing that resembled the feeling he would have had in her position. What he would have felt in her position was satisfaction, the specific satisfaction of a plan working. She had not looked satisfied. She had looked, he searched his language. He had 17 words for anticipation in various registers and gradations, and none of them fit. She had looked like someone who had already paid for something and was now simply collecting it, and the collection was not a pleasure, but a matter of course. He thought about the 2 years. He had known, abstractly, that the coalition had been fighting the Veth in the Keln systems. He had tracked the conflict the way he tracked all conflicts, as a background variable that affected route planning and insurance premiums. He had known there were marine deployments. He had known the Keln systems were contested. He had not thought, in any specific sense, about what 2 years in a contested system did to the people who were in it, because why would he think about that? It was not relevant to his calculations. He sat with the understanding that it had been relevant, that it had been, in fact, the only thing that mattered. He had looked at the numbers and seen a civilian transport. 9 crew, 60% hold, 3% overlisted. Within variation. He had not seen, had no category for seeing, what 2 years looked like in the bodies of 400 people who were finally, provisionally, tentatively being allowed to stop. He thought about the sound that had come through the bulkhead on the 8th day. The low resonant sound that spread through the ship's metal the way heat spread, slowly, from the center outward. He had not known what it was. He had sat in his captain's chair and listened to it through the hull plating and felt something he did not have a word for. Not fear, not comfort exactly, something older than both, something that had no name in his language because his language had never needed a word for it. He thought, perhaps there was a word. Perhaps he simply did not know it. He lay down on the cot. He looked at the ceiling of the detention bay. He thought, 43 operations. He thought, the scan had never lied to him. He thought, the scan had told him everything it was capable of telling him, and what it was capable of telling him was not enough, had never been enough, and the insufficiency was not the scan's failing, but his own for believing that what could be measured was what there was. He thought about Riven in the doorway. He thought about the 7 seconds. He thought about what she had said when he asked what they would have done. He turned the words over. We would have had something to do. He turned them over again. In his language there were words for controlled aggression, for readiness, for professional capability. He did not have a phrase for what she had meant. The phrase she had used was simple, and it carried inside it something that his language did not have a container for. And he lay on the cot and felt the edges of the thing that had no container and understood, privately and permanently, that this was the thing his scan had not seen, that no scan could see, that existed not as a measurable property, but as a quality of something that had been carried for a very long time and had not broken. He closed his eyes. He did not sleep for a long time. When he did not dream about the scan, or the math, or the approach vector, or any of the things he had been dreaming about for 11 days. He dreamed about a door, and light beyond it, and the specific quality of the silence on his side of the door while he decided whether to open it. He did not open it, but he stood there for a long time. And in the morning, when Sorvin's medical officer came to check on him, he asked her, in careful coalition standard, for a pen and something to write on. She gave them to him without asking why. He sat on the cot with the pen in his hand for a long time, looking at the blank surface of the paper. Then he wrote a number. 412. He folded the paper. He put it in his pocket. He had no plan for it. He did not know what he would do with it. He knew only that he needed to carry it. The way you carried things that had no resolution, that were not problems to be solved, but facts to be held. And the holding was the only response available, and the holding was, in its way, enough. The Calliope reached port 4 days later. She came in on the standard civilian approach vector, lights running, drives cycling down through the deceleration burn in the long clean arc that old ships made when they knew their own weight, and she settled into berth 14 at Morel Station with the particular sound of docking clamps finding their seats that sounded the same on every ship at every port, in every system Riven had ever come through, a sound that meant, here. Still here. Done for now. The regiment began to offload at 0800. They came down the ramp in columns, 4 across, and they did not look like soldiers coming home from a war. They looked like people carrying luggage through a transit hub, purposeful, unhurried, reading the signs, thinking about where they needed to be next. Riven stood at the base of the ramp and watched them go and checked the manifest against the faces and found every face present, for 112, all of them walking, all of them moving through the port on their own legs under their own power, and this fact landed somewhere in her chest without her having words for it. She was last down. She had always been last down. She had been last down on every deployment, every transit, every time she had moved people from one place to another for 18 years, because last down meant she had watched everyone else go first and could confirm, with her own eyes, that they were all still there. She stepped off the ramp onto the station deck. The station smelled like recycled air and machine oil, and the specific compressed human smell of a transit hub that processed 10,000 people a day, and underneath all of that, coming from somewhere down the main concourse, the faint warm smell of something baking. She stood still for a moment. She breathed in. Colt was beside her. She hadn't heard him come up. He did that sometimes, moved into the space next to her without announcing himself. The way you moved into familiar territory, not because he was assigned there, but because that was where he had been for 7 years, and the habit had settled into both of them the way habits settled when they had been tested enough times to become structural. He was looking down the concourse. "There's a place," he said, "down that way, near the main gate. I can smell it." "I can smell it too," she said. "Could be anything. Pressed protein, artificial flavoring, military grade." "It's not pressed protein," she said. He was quiet for a moment. "No," he said. "It's not." They stood at the base of the ramp for another few seconds, the flow of the regiment parting around them and rejoining on the other side like water around two stones, and the smell of the bakery came down the concourse, and the station hummed with its own particular life. And somewhere behind them the Calliope's drives were cooling with the specific ticking sound of old metal releasing heat. And somewhere ahead 400 people were finding their way through the port toward whatever came next. Riven picked up her kit bag. She said, "Come on." And they walked down the concourse together, into the smell of it. That night, in the place with the bread that had been there 60 years and would be there when they were not, Riven sat at a small table near the window and ate, and the bread was real, yeast bread, the crust sounding the way she had remembered it would sound, and the inside was warm, and she held a piece of it in her hand and looked at the window and the port activity beyond the glass and thought about nothing, which was something she had been trying to do since they crossed the departure line 3 weeks ago, and for the first time, briefly, imperfectly, she managed it. The stone was still there. She was not pretending the stone wasn't there. But she was sitting in a bakery 60 years old, holding bread that had taken 3 days to make, and the stone was in her chest where she had moved it, where carried things lived, and it was not in her skull where it had been, and the difference was the difference between weight and obstruction, and she was beginning to understand, carefully, without rushing the understanding, that the difference was real. She thought about Colt's noodle bowl. She thought about Tara running drills in the hold with her eyes focused inward. She thought about Jax sleeping with his arms crossed like a monument to stillness. She thought about Mace's instrument, the sound of it spreading through old metal, and the 20 people who had stopped what they were doing and listened with their whole bodies and not said a word about it afterward. She thought about Var's face at the hatch. She thought about Shrev's voice on the channel, "I want to understand," and the specific quality of the question, which had not been tactical but something else, the question of someone who had run up against the edge of their model and was trying, honestly, to see past it. She did not know what he would do with what he had seen. She knew what she did with things that didn't fit the model. She carried them. She suspected he would carry his too. People carried things. It was the fundamental technology. She looked at her hand. She was holding the bread. Her hand was open, palm up, the bread resting in it. And her hand was not shaking. And the not shaking was not the cold stillness of the firebase in the mud at 0300, not the stillness of a decision being made. It was a different kind of stillness entirely. It was the stillness of a hand that was holding something warm and was not required to do anything else. She sat with this for a long time. In the after of a thing like this, there is always a record, a scan log, a manifest, an incident report with 4 minutes of flat sequential narration, and the notation incidental contact with surfaces doing a great deal of work. There are transfer documents and detention intake forms and a distress signal filed with the coalition registry and a response time of 16 hours flagged for commendation. There is a maintenance log for 1 broken thermostat and 300 in hard currency noted as miscellaneous operational offset. There is a medical evaluation noting a hairline fracture in the right wrist of a detainee who did not report it and who received treatment under protest and was released into coalition custody, fully ambulatory. The record does not contain the sound of Mace's instrument moving through old metal in the dark. It does not contain Colt's dream about the egg going into the broth. It does not contain the 4 seconds that Tara and Var spent looking at each other through the hatch glass. The silence between them that was not friendship, but was something that had no colder name. It does not contain the 3 jokes, which were terrible and necessary in the specific way that terrible necessary things were, which was to say they were the human mind insisting on its own presence, its own aliveness, its own refusal to be only what the situation was trying to make it. The record does not contain the piece of paper in Shrev's pocket. The record does not contain what Riven found in a bakery, briefly, imperfectly, for the first time in 6 weeks. The record is accurate. The record is insufficient. This is always true of records. For this reason, records are made of what can be measured, and what can be measured is never the whole of a thing. The whole of a thing lives in the parts that resist measurement, in the quality of a silence, in the specific weight of a choice that the person who made it will carry forever without the carrying being visible from the outside, in the sound of something that spreads through cold metal the way warmth spreads from the center outward without asking permission. The Calliope came into port with 412. She left port with 412. Every record confirms this. The records are correct. The records do not know what the 412 brought back with them that had no weight on a scanner and no line on a manifest and no category in the Coalition Registry's cargo classification system. What they had been accumulating for 2 years and were only now, in dribs and uneven increments, beginning to set down, not all at once, not cleanly, not without cost, but beginning. What they had been, out there, was necessary. What they had done was necessary. The weight of necessary things does not disappear when the necessity ends. It transfers. It moves from the skull to the chest, from the chest to the hands, from the hands, eventually, in the long, patient work of years, to somewhere that is not quite inside the body anymore. Not gone, never gone, but held at a distance that allows for other things to also be true at the same time. A bowl of noodles with a soft egg. A loaf of bread that took 3 days. A 12-string resonance box with a patch of calm wire and adhesive seal tape. The specific, unremarkable miracle of 20 people in a hold being quiet together. The Marines of the 14th Coalition Regiment came home from Kelm, for on an old civilian transport with a broken thermostat and a chief engineer who had been carrying water tanks for 11 years that he no longer needed. They came home with what they had always come home with, which was all of them, minus the ones they had lost, which were too many, in which they would carry the way you carried the things that had no resolution, not as wounds, exactly, not as damage, exactly, but as weight, which was not damage, which was something harder and more permanent than damage, which was love made specific by loss. They came home. Some of them knew what that meant. Some of them were still finding out. Some of them would spend years finding out and not fully arrive, and some of them would find it suddenly in the middle of an ordinary moment, a smell, a sound, something warm held in an open hand. And it would not be peace, exactly, and it would not be resolution, exactly, but it would be real, which was enough, which had always been enough for people who understood the difference between what they needed and what they wished for. This is the thing about soldiers, about all soldiers, in all the long record of human beings making war and surviving it, and carrying it home. They do not stop. Not the way people mean when they say that. The grim, unrelenting endlessness of it. They do not stop the other way. They do not stop reaching for the bowl of noodles. They do not stop listening to the music in the dark. They do not stop making the terrible joke at the wrong moment because the joke is the mind saying, I am still here. I am still here. I am still here. And neither the war nor the aftermath nor the weight of the thing carried has been able to make that voice go quiet. Not in all the history of human beings at war. Not in all the years of contested systems and fire lines and decisions made in the dark with steady hands. Not in any of the 10,000 places where people who carried everything that could be carried got back up and went on. Not because they were not broken, not because the weight was manageable, but because getting up was the oldest thing human beings had ever done, and it was encoded somewhere deeper than memory, deeper than training, deeper than anything the enemy had ever been able to measure or model or predict. They kept getting up. They got up. They carried the weight. They found the bakery. They sat at the table. They held the bread in their open hands, and the bread was warm, and for a moment, brief and imperfect and completely real, they were not required to do anything else, and the hands that had been steady in the dark and would be steady again when they were needed were, for now, in this moment, in this ordinary place, at rest.